We're going to talk a little bit more about the issues facing Muslim youth in 2010. Now, we have two special guests with us, Jihad Brown from the Tabah Foundation here in Abu Dhabi, and Tayyibah Taylor, who is in Atlanta. She is editor-in-chief of Azizah Magazine. Jihad, let me start with you. It is we hear so many different messages when we talk about Muslim youth in 2010. Of course, there is this pull towards extremism, but as we saw in the story too there, another message in those that are much more moderation. Why are people raised in the West, who are familiar with Western values, attracted to Islamic extremism?
Well, I think it's a feeling of identification with what's going on with Muslims in other parts of the world. The sense of fraternity in the Muslim world is very strong. I think that youth, whether they be in the Muslim world, whether they be in the West, they feel frustrated that these grievances that they perceive are not being redressed by those in authority, and then lack of avenues for for peaceful redress of these grievances.
Tayyibah Taylor, let me ask you then, do you agree with that? Is there a sense of frustration, and is the extremist voice drowning out the more moderate voice when it comes to Muslim youth?
No, I certainly don't think so. And I think that the Muslim youth in Western countries have the advantage of a legacy of critical thinking, an academic legacy of critical thinking. And the majority of them really examine and analyze things so that they don't come up with the conclusion that violence is the way to affect change, lasting change.
And yet we still do see the attraction of youth to groups like al-Shabaab in Somalia, to groups like al-Qaeda. We've seen al-Awlaki in Yemen, of course, issue his rallying cry for people to rise up against the West. So it still exists. How do you meet that voice and meet that challenge?
Well, I certainly think that, as we just saw al-hidayah, the speeches that were given I think is a way to go. I often premise my speeches by saying that war and using violence as a way to a solution for our problems is something that's far outdated. I think war is an institution that has outlived its usefulness and has outlived its effectiveness. I think as human beings and as people who profess to worship the source of peace, that we can evolve beyond a point where we're relying on retaliation and revenge and transcend that to a point where we can affect our changes, a positive change in the world and in our lives through compassion and consensus and cooperation, instead of trying to dominate, control, and coerce others into our beliefs.
Jihad, let me ask you, is there a difference between Muslim youth in Western countries, predominantly non-Muslim countries, and those who are growing up in very strict Muslim countries, people who are growing up in the Middle East or in parts of Asia? Can you define a difference there in their outlook?
Well, it depends on the perspective that we're using to look at the youth. I think that what plagues Muslim youth in the world is the same thing, or what concerns Muslim youth in the world are the same things that concern youth everywhere in the world. Access to education. And once I get access to education, is there going to be a job for me? I think that Ms. Taylor made a really good point in that the vast majority of young Muslims throughout the world are not attracted to extremism. And I think that we need to work harder to give them a voice and allow them to demonstrate role modeling of how there are peaceful ways to redress grievance. I mean, the Quran prefers always diplomatic solutions to conflict, but there's so much more to life than conflict. There's so much more to being Muslim than issues of conflict and problems. I think that we need to start talking more about what's right about Islam than just Islam as a problem.
I wanted to ask you about the role of Islamic leadership and what do Muslims look for from their own leaders. It's been often said that they perceive a failure of leadership. Is that the way you see it?
Well, there's a vacuum of leadership, definitely. We need a visionary leadership that understands the circumstances and context of the world that we live in and can take the Muslim community to a space where they can see solutions where they can engage with the world around them, with the global community. They can be contributors to the global community. For example, on issues of women, like you brought up before, we have a lot of educated Muslim women in sacred law already. We need to enable their voice. We have to hear more from them. We need to enable conduits for a contribution of the feminine to Muslim society. This cannot happen without visionary leadership. So filling the leadership vacuum, you talked about extremism before. There's much more to Islam than these issues of extremism, but leadership is what can enable Muslims to bring out all of these things that are good and right about Islam.
Jihad, thank you for joining us on this special, and Tayyibah Taylor also in Atlanta, thank you. We've been discussing the role of Islam in 2010, particularly the role of youth and also the role of women in Islam as well.